The February wind cut through Chicago like a knife, but inside the grand Steinberg concert hall, everything was warm and golden. The lobby sparkled with crystal chandeliers that threw tiny rainbows across the marble floor. It was the kind of place where every footstep echoed with importance, where even the air seemed to cost money to breathe. A boy named Darius pushed through the heavy glass doors, holding them open for his grandmother. At 14, he was all knees and elbows, growing too fast for his clothes to keep up. His jacket was clean but clearly second-hand, with a zipper that stuck halfway up. His grandmother, Mrs. Robinson, walked slowly beside him, her best church, dress pressed perfectly, her purse clutched tight against her side. They stood there for a moment, just taking it all in. The lobby was buzzing with activity. Parents in designer coats checked their phones while their children warmed up on practice keyboards with headphones. Everyone seemed to know exactly where they belonged, moving through the space like they owned it. Darius had never seen anything like this place. Back home, the fanciest building on his block was the grocery store that had just gotten automatic doors. This was something else entirely. The floors were so shiny he could see his reflection, and he suddenly became very aware of the scuff marks on his sneakers. "Come on, baby," his grandmother whispered, touching his elbow gently. "We didn't come all this way to stand in the doorway." They made their way to the registration desk, weaving between groups of people who didn't seem to notice them at all. Behind the desk sat a woman with glasses perched on her nose, typing something into a computer. Next to her stood a man in a navy suit that probably cost more than Mrs. Robinson's monthly rent. His name tag read, Richard Pemberton, hall manager. "Excuse me," Mrs. Robinson said, her voice steady and polite. "We're here for the young pianist competition. This is my grandson, Darius Robinson." The woman with the glasses looked up, her fingers pausing on the keyboard. But it was Pemberton who spoke first. His eyes traveled from Darius's worn sneakers, up his faded jeans, past the stubborn zipper, and finally to his face. The manager's expression shifted, just slightly, like he'd bitten into something sour and was trying not to show it. "The competition," Pemberton repeated slowly as if he hadn't heard correctly. "This competition?" "Yes, sir," Mrs. Robinson replied. She opened her purse and began searching for their paperwork. "Darius received an invitation to compete. We have it right here somewhere." Pemberton exchanged a look with the woman at the computer. It was quick, but Darius caught it. He'd seen that look before, at school, in stores. Whenever he went somewhere, people thought he didn't belong. "Perhaps there's been some mistake," Pemberton said, his voice smooth as oil. "This is the regional finals for classical piano. The participants have been studying for years. They've had private instructors, conservatory training. My grandson can play," Mrs. Robinson said simply. Her back straightened a little more, the way it did when someone questioned her word. Pemberton's laugh was soft but sharp around the edges. "I'm sure he can play something. But this isn't about playing chopsticks or whatever they teach in public school music class. These young musicians perform Chopin, Liszt, Rachmaninoff. Do you understand the level we're talking about?" The lobby seemed to quiet down around them. A few parents had stopped their conversations to watch. A girl in a velvet dress paused her practice to stare. Darius felt heat creeping up his neck, but his grandmother's hand found his and squeezed it tight. "We understand perfectly," Mrs. Robinson said. "And I'll ask you to watch your tone, Mr. Pemberton. We've traveled 6 hours on a bus to be here. Darius has worked harder than you could possibly imagine for this opportunity." Pemberton's assistant had stopped typing entirely now. She looked uncomfortable, her eyes darting between her boss and the small crowd that was forming. Someone had taken out their phone, pretending to text but clearly recording. "Ma'am," Pemberton said, and now his voice had an edge of condescension that made Darius's stomach turn. "I'm trying to save you from embarrassment. This competition, the entry fee alone is $300. The participants here have been preparing with teachers who charge more per hour than most people make in a day. I don't think you understand what you've walked into." "The fee was waived," Mrs. Robinson said quietly, "because of Darius's scores in the preliminary round." This made Pemberton pause. His forehead creased as he turned to his assistant. "Pull up the preliminary scores," he ordered. The woman's fingers flew across the keyboard. After a moment, she said, "I don't see a Darius Robinson in our system for the preliminary round, Mr. Pemberton." "Of course you don't," Pemberton said, triumphant now. He turned back to Mrs. Robinson with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "As I suspected, a misunderstanding. Perhaps your grandson is talented for his circumstances. But this competition is for serious musicians, young people who've dedicated their lives to the craft." Darius felt his grandmother's hand trembling slightly in his. Not from fear. He knew his grandmother didn't fear anyone, but from anger. The kind of anger that comes from a lifetime of having to prove yourself over and over again. "My grandson is a serious musician," she said, each word deliberate and clear. Pemberton sighed dramatically, playing to the crowd that had gathered. "Ma'am, please look around you. Do you see anyone else here who looks like they just wandered in from a basketball court?" He gestured to Darius's height, his athletic build, the assumption clear in every word. That's when something in the air shifted. The crowd wasn't on Pemberton's side anymore. Parents were frowning. A few teenagers looked disgusted. One mother whispered to another, "Is he really saying what I think he's saying?" Pemberton seemed to sense he was losing the room. He straightened his tie and cleared his throat. "I'm simply being realistic. Classical piano requires a certain background, a certain upbringing. It's not something you can just pick up." "Is that right?" Mrs. Robinson asked. Her voice was dangerously quiet now. "And what exactly is that background, Mr. Pemberton? Please tell us all what you really mean." The manager's face flushed red. He looked around at the watching crowd, at the phones that were definitely recording now, and made a decision to double down. "Fine," he said loudly. "You want me to be direct? I'll be direct. This is one of the most prestigious youth piano competitions in the country. We've had winners go on to Juilliard, to the Vienna Conservatory. They've performed with symphony orchestras around the world. And you're telling me that this boy," he gestured dismissively at Darius, "in his second-hand clothes with no formal training, belongs here with these other students? It's absurd." The lobby was completely silent now. Even the air conditioning seemed to have stopped humming. Everyone was watching, waiting. Pemberton looked around at all the faces, seeming to feed off the attention. He laughed again, louder this time, more theatrical. "I'll tell you what," he announced, his voice carrying across the entire lobby. "If this boy can actually play classical piano, real classical piano, not some simplified version, if he can play at the level of this competition." He paused for effect, a smirk spreading across his face. "I'll kneel right here on this marble floor, in front of everyone." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Parents pulled their children closer. The security guard had stood up from his desk, unsure if he should intervene. Mrs. Robinson's grip on Darius's hand tightened. She looked at her grandson, and in her eyes, he saw the same fire that had gotten them through every hard day, every missed meal, every time someone told them they couldn't do something. "You'll kneel?" she asked, her voice carrying a strength that seemed to fill the entire space. "You promise? In front of all these witnesses?" Pemberton laughed, certain of his victory. "If he plays the piano at competition level, I'll kneel right here. When he can't, you'll leave quietly and stop wasting everyone's time." The challenge hung in the air like a living thing, electric and dangerous, waiting to see who would make the next move. 3 years before that moment in the concert hall, Darius Robinson was just another 11-year-old trying to stay out of trouble in one of Chicago's forgotten neighborhoods. The kind of place where the news only showed up when something bad happened, where most kids learned early that dreams were luxuries they couldn't afford. His school, Jefferson Middle, was the type of building that had seen better days about 40 years ago. Paint peeled off the walls like dead skin, and half the windows were covered with boards instead of glass. The music program had been cut years before Darius arrived. Budget problems, they said. The band room sat empty on the 3rd floor, its door usually locked, forgotten by everyone except the janitor who stored cleaning supplies there. But one September afternoon, that door was open. Darius wasn't supposed to be wandering the halls. During lunch, he was supposed to be in the cafeteria, eating the sandwich his grandmother had packed with careful hands that morning. But some older boys had been giving him trouble, and he'd learned it was better to disappear than to fight. So he climbed the stairs to the third floor where nobody ever went, and that's when he heard it. Music. Real music, not the hip-hop blasting from someone's phone or the angry metal from passing cars. This was something different, something that made him stop walking and just listen. It was coming from the old band room. He peered through the doorway and saw Mr. Chen, the art teacher, sitting at a piano he'd never known was there. The instrument was pushed against the back wall, covered in dust except for the keys, which Mr. Chen's fingers were dancing across like they were old friends. The melody was sad and beautiful at the same time, the kind of sound that made your chest feel tight and full all at once. When the music stopped, Mr. Chen looked up and saw him. Darius expected to get yelled at, told to go back to lunch. Instead, the teacher smiled. "You like Chopin?" Mr. Chen asked. Darius didn't know what or who Chopin was, so he just shrugged. "It sounds nice. Want to try?" That question changed everything. Mr. Chen showed him how to sit, how to hold his hands, how each key had a name and a purpose. Darius thought it would be easy. Just push the keys and make sounds, right? But when he tried to copy what Mr. Chen had played, it sounded like cats fighting. The teacher laughed, not mean but encouraging. "Nobody gets it right the first time," Mr. Chen said. "Music is like anything else worth doing. It takes practice." Mr. Chen could only stay for lunch periods twice a week. He had his art classes to teach, after all. But he gave Darius permission to use the room whenever it was empty. He even convinced the principal to give Darius a key, saying the boy was helping him organize old music equipment. At first, Darius could only make noise. His fingers were clumsy, too used to catching footballs and holding pencils to move the way the piano demanded. But something about the instrument called to him. Maybe it was the way each note rang out clear and true, no matter who you were or where you came from. The piano didn't care that his shoes had holes or that his mom was gone. It only cared if you hit the right key at the right time. He started staying after school every day. His grandmother thought he'd joined a study group, and he let her believe it because it was easier than explaining why he was obsessed with an instrument. Most people in their neighborhood had never even seen up close. While other kids were playing video games or hanging out on street corners, Darius was in that dusty room, teaching himself to read music from old books Mr. Chen had found in a closet. The winter that year was brutal. The heating in the band room barely worked, and Darius had to wear his coat and blow on his fingers between songs to keep them warm enough to play. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. When he played, the world made sense in a way it never had before. Every emotion he couldn't put into words, the anger at his situation, the sadness about his mom, the fear that he'd never be anything more than another statistic, it all poured out through his fingers into the keys. YouTube became his teacher when Mr. Chen wasn't around. The library had free internet, and Darius spent hours watching videos of famous pianists, slowing them down to see exactly where their fingers went. He learned that Chopin was a person, a composer who had written the piece Mr. Chen played that first day. He learned about Mozart, who started playing when he was just 5 years old. Beethoven, who kept composing even after he went deaf. These weren't just names in a history book to Darius. They were proof that music was bigger than circumstances, that it could lift you above whatever tried to hold you down. 6 months into his secret piano life, Mr. Chen heard him playing a piece he'd learned entirely from YouTube, a simplified version of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. The teacher stood in the doorway for the entire piece, and when Darius finished, he saw tears in the man's eyes. "Darius," Mr. Chen said slowly, "you need a real teacher." "Can't afford it," Darius said simply. It wasn't self-pity, just fact. Mr. Chen was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I know someone. Let me make a call." The someone turned out to be Mrs. Fitzgerald, a 70-year-old woman who had once played with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. She lived in a tiny apartment 40 minutes away by bus, and when Mr. Chen first brought Darius to meet her, She looked at him over her glasses like she was reading his soul. "Play," she commanded, pointing to the grand piano that took up half her living room. Darius played the only complete piece he knew by heart, that same Moonlight Sonata he'd taught himself. When he finished, Mrs. Fitzgerald was silent for so long he thought she was going to kick him out. "You're holding your wrists wrong," she finally said. "Your fingering is atrocious. Your tempo is all over the place." She paused. "And you have more raw talent than any student I've taught in 20 years. She agreed to teach him for free, but only if he promised 3 things. Show up every Saturday without fail, practice at least 3 hours every day, and never let anyone tell him. He didn't belong in the world of classical music. "They'll try," she warned him. "They'll say you're the wrong color from the wrong neighborhood with the wrong background. They'll make you feel like an imposter. But music doesn't care about any of that. Music only cares about truth. And if you play with truth, nobody can take that away from you." For the next 2 years, Darius lived a double life. At school, he was just another kid from the neighborhood. But in the band room, in Mrs. Fitzgerald's apartment, he was becoming something else. His fingers learned to dance across the keys with increasing grace. He mastered pieces that most adults couldn't play, each note a small victory against everyone who'd already written him off. His grandmother finally found out the truth when she came to school early one day to bring him a forgotten textbook. She heard music coming from the 3rd floor and followed it, finding her grandson at the piano, lost in a world she didn't know he'd been visiting. He expected her to be angry that he'd been keeping secrets. Instead, she sat on a dusty chair and listened to him play for an hour, tears streaming down her face the entire time. "Your mama always said you'd do something special," she whispered when he finally stopped. "Said it even when you were still in her belly. This one's going to surprise the world," she'd tell me. I guess she knew something we didn't. That memory, his mother's faith in him before he was even born, became the fuel that drove him through the hardest pieces, the longest practices, the days when his fingers cramped and his back ached, and the music seemed impossible. He wasn't just playing for himself anymore. He was playing for his grandmother, who worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat, for Mr. Chen, who'd opened that first door, for Mrs. Fitzgerald, who poured all her knowledge into him, for his mother, who'd believed in him before he'd taken his first breath. And now, standing in that marble lobby with Pemberton's challenge hanging in the air, all those hours, all that sacrifice, all that secret joy and pain had led to this moment. The boy who'd found a dusty piano in an abandoned room was about to show everyone what 3 years of determination looked like when you refused to let the world tell you who you couldn't be. The silence in the lobby was so thick you could almost touch it. Every eye was fixed on the scene unfolding at the registration desk. Parents had stopped pretending to check their phones. Children in their competition outfits had forgotten about their warm-up exercises. Even the security guard had taken a few steps closer, as if drawn by an invisible magnet. Mrs. Robinson's hand was still in her purse, searching through the carefully organized contents. Darius knew that purse. It held everything important in their life. Insurance cards they could barely afford to use, coupons clipped from Sunday papers, photographs wrapped in plastic to protect them from wear. And somewhere in there an envelope that had arrived 2 months ago, treated like a holy relic ever since. "Here," she said finally, pulling out a cream-colored envelope that had been folded carefully in half. The paper was worn at the edges from being handled so many times, from being shown to Mrs. Fitzgerald, to Mr. Chen, to their pastor at church who'd led a prayer for Darius's success. She unfolded it slowly, deliberately, and pulled out the letter inside. The official letterhead of the National Young Pianist Foundation was visible even from a distance. She handed it to Pemberton with a steady hand. "Read it out loud," she said, "so everyone can hear." Pemberton took the letter like it might bite him. His eyes scanned it quickly, and Darius watched the color drain from his face, then flood back. "Read." His assistant leaned over to look, and her eyes widened. "This is—" Pemberton started, then stopped. He cleared his throat. "This appears to be an invitation to compete, yes, but there must be some error in our system. The preliminary round he supposedly won, we have no record of it. Check again, Mrs. Robinson said. Her voice was calm, but Darius could hear the steel underneath. Check under D. Robinson. Sometimes they file it wrong. The assistant's fingers flew across the keyboard. After a moment, she made a small sound of surprise. Mr. Pemberton, I found it. D. Robinson, age 14, Chicago District. Perfect score in the technical evaluation. Highest marks in interpretation. She looked up. Her face flushed. He didn't just qualify. He had the highest preliminary score in the entire Midwest region. The crowd reacted with murmurs and whispers. A woman in a fur coat said loudly enough for everyone to hear. The highest. Score, this boy? Pemberton's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. He set the letter down on the desk and straightened his tie again. A nervous habit that was becoming more obvious. Well, he said, trying to regain control of the situation. A high score in a preliminary round is one thing. Those are often judged by, let's say, less experienced evaluators. The real competition is something entirely different. The pressure, the acoustics of a proper venue, the caliber of judges. It's not the same as playing in some community center. Is that so? Mrs. Robinson asked. She looked around the lobby, taking in the grand piano that sat on a small raised platform near the window. It was obviously meant for decoration, maybe, the occasional demonstration, but it was a real piano, a Steinway from the look of it. Seems to me you've got a proper venue right here, and plenty of witnesses to judge for themselves. The crowd pressed closer. Someone shouted, "Let him play." Others joined in with murmurs of agreement. Pemberton looked trapped. He glanced at his assistant, who gave him a helpless shrug. He looked at the crowd, at the phone still recording, at the security guard who seemed more interested in watching than intervening. "Fine," he said, his voice trying to sound confident but coming out strained. "Let's settle this right now. But I want everyone to be clear about what we're doing here. This isn't some feel-good moment from a movie. Classical piano at competition level requires years of training, technical precision, emotional maturity. It's not something you can fake or learn from watching videos online." He walked out from behind the desk, his expensive shoes clicking on the marble floor. The crowd parted to let him through as he made his way to the piano. He ran his hand along, its polished surface then turned to face everyone. "This is a Steinway Model B," he announced like he was giving a tour. "Worth more than most people's cars. It requires a delicate touch, proper hand position, an understanding of dynamics that takes years to develop. You can't just bang on it like a keyboard in a church basement." Darius felt his hands curl into fists. This man didn't know about the frozen band room, about Mrs. Fitzgerald's cramped apartment, about the hours he'd spent with his face inches from the screen of a library computer, studying the hand movements of pianists he'd never meet. This man didn't know anything. "So here's my offer," Pemberton continued, his voice carrying across the silent lobby. "Let the boy play. If, and I mean if, he can perform a competition-level piece, not some simplified version, not some pop song arrangement, but a real, classical piece the way it was meant to be played, then yes, I'll honor my word. I'll kneel right here on this marble floor." He paused, a smirk returning to his face. "But when he can't, and I assure you he can't, then you'll leave quietly. No scene, no complaints, no social media posts about discrimination or unfair treatment. You'll accept that this competition is beyond your grandson's current abilities and leave with whatever dignity you can maintain. Deal?" Mrs. Robinson looked at Darius. In her eyes he saw the question she wasn't asking out loud. He thought about all those Saturdays on the bus to Mrs. Fitzgerald's apartment. He thought about Mr. Chen sneaking him sheet music ordered with his own money. He thought about his mother, who he barely remembered but whose faith in him his grandmother never let him forget. He nodded. Just once. "Deal," Mrs. Robinson said. The crowd seemed to exhale collectively. People moved to create a path from where Darius stood to the piano. It felt like the longest walk of his life. Each step echoed in the marble hall. He could feel every eye on him. Some hoping he'd succeed, others, he could tell, waiting for him to fail. to confirm what they already believed about kids like him. As he walked, he heard whispers. "This is insane. That poor kid. $20 says he runs out crying. Did you see his shoes? They're held together with duct tape." But he also heard, "I hope he shows that snob. My daughter says she's seen him at the library, always watching piano videos. Sometimes the best musicians come from the hardest places." When he reached the piano, Darius stopped. The instrument was beautiful, its black surface so polished he could see his reflection clearly for the first time. He looked young, younger than he felt. His jacket was indeed secondhand, his hair needed a trim, and yes, there was duct tape on his left shoe where the sole had started to separate. But his hands knew what to do. He pulled out the bench and sat down. The height was wrong, and he adjusted it carefully, taking his time. Pemberton made an impatient sound, but Darius didn't rush. Mrs. Fitzgerald had taught him that the setup was just as important as the performance. The keys gleamed white and black, perfect and untouched, so different from the yellowed keys in the band room, or the ones at Mrs. Fitzgerald's that had chips and scratches from decades of use. These keys looked like they'd never known struggle, never been played by desperate fingers trying to make something beautiful out of nothing. Darius placed his hands on his thighs and closed his eyes. The lobby was so quiet he could hear his own heartbeat. He thought about what piece to play. It had to be something that would leave no room for doubt. No way for Pemberton to claim it wasn't competition level. Then he knew, the piece that had started it all. The one Mr. Chen had played that first day. The one that had reached through the dusty air of an abandoned band room and grabbed his soul. Chopin's Ballad No. 1 in G minor. One of the most technically demanding pieces in the classical repertoire. The kind of piece that pianists with decades of experience still struggled with. He raised his hands, positioning them above the keys. The crowd held its breath. Pemberton stood with his arms crossed, that smirk still playing on his lips, so certain of what was about to happen. Darius took one last breath, feeling the weight of 3 years of practice in his fingers. The ghost of his mother's faith in his heart and his grandmother's unwavering love at his back. Then he began to play. The first note rang out like a bell in a cathedral. It wasn't just a sound. It was a declaration, clear, confident, and absolutely perfect. Darius's finger had barely touched the key, but the tone that emerged filled every corner of the marble lobby. Several people in the crowd gasped. This wasn't what they expected from a 14-year-old boy in second-hand clothes. Then came the second note, and the third, and suddenly the introduction to Chopin's Ballad No. 1 was flowing from Darius's fingers like water from a spring. The gentle, almost hesitant beginning that Chopin had written to draw listeners in, to make them lean forward and pay attention. Pemberton's smirk froze on his face. His assistant's mouth fell open slightly. The security guard, who had been ready to escort them out just minutes ago, set down his radio and stared. As Darius moved deeper into the piece, the music began to tell its story. This wasn't just notes on a page. This was Chopin's heart poured out in sound, filtered through the soul of a boy who understood struggle in ways the composer would have recognized. The melody sang of longing, of dreams deferred but not destroyed, of beauty that blooms in the most unexpected places. His left hand began the rolling accompaniment that made this piece so challenging, each note precisely placed while his right hand carried the melody above it. It was like watching someone juggle crystal glasses while dancing. One wrong move and everything would shatter. But Darius's hands moved with the certainty of someone who had played this piece 1,000 times in his mind before his fingers ever touched a piano. A woman in the crowd whispered, "My God," and then covered her mouth, embarrassed to have spoken. But others were having the same reaction. Parents who had brought their own children to compete were watching with expressions of awe and something that might have been fear. Fear that their expensively trained children would have to compete against this. The piece moved into its first, dramatic section, where the tempo picks up and the technical demands become fierce. This was where most young pianists would falter, where the difference between adequate and exceptional became clear. Darius's fingers flew across the keys, but it never felt rushed. Each note was distinct, crystalline, exactly where it should be. His body swayed slightly with the music, not in some practiced, theatrical way, but naturally, like the piano was an extension of himself. Mrs. Robinson stood perfectly still, but tears were streaming down her face. She wasn't trying to hide them, or wipe them away. She let them fall, each drop a testament to every sacrifice, every dollar saved, every prayer whispered in the dark when she wondered how they'd make it through another month. She heard something in the music that perhaps only she could hear, the echo of her daughter's voice, Darius's mother, humming melodies to her belly when she was pregnant, as if she was already teaching her unborn son the language of music. Pemberton had taken a step backward without realizing it. The color had completely drained from his face. His arms, which had been crossed in defiance, now hung limply at his sides. He was hearing what everyone was hearing, not just technical proficiency, not just the notes played correctly, but something more. This was artistry. This was the kind of playing that made people remember why classical music had survived for centuries. The ballade moved into its quiet middle section, a moment of reflection before the storm. Darius's touch became so delicate that people held their breath, afraid that even breathing might disturb the spell. The notes fell like raindrops on still water, each one creating ripples of emotion that spread through the crowd. A teenage girl who had been warming up for her own performance had tears running down her cheeks. Her mother put an arm around her, but she too was crying. Then, like thunder after the calm, came the fierce final section. This was where Chopin demanded everything from a pianist: speed, power, precision, and somehow, through it all, the ability to maintain the emotional thread of the piece. Darius's hands became a blur, but a controlled blur. The music crashed and soared, violent and beautiful at once. It was the sound of every obstacle he'd faced, every time someone had looked at him and seen limits instead of potential, every cold night in that band room when he'd practiced until his fingers were numb. But it was also the sound of triumph. Not the easy triumph of someone born to privilege, but the hard-won victory of someone who had to fight for every note, every lesson, every moment at the piano. The music said what Darius could never put into words. I belong here. I deserve to be heard. You cannot dismiss me. A man in an expensive suit, clearly one of the other parents, had taken out his phone, but not to record. He was texting furiously, and those close enough could see the words, "You have to hear this, kid. Get down here now." The climax of the piece approached, the moment where Chopin brought all the themes together in a final explosive statement. Darius's entire body was involved now, his shoulders moving, his back straight but flexible, every muscle working in harmony to create this torrent of sound. The Steinway, which Pemberton had bragged about moments ago, seemed to come alive under Darius's hands. It was doing things that piano hadn't done in years, singing with a voice it didn't know it had. And then, in the space of a heartbeat, it was over. The last chord rang out, suspended in the air like a question that had finally been answered. Darius held his hands above the keys for a moment, the way Mrs. Fitzgerald had taught him, letting the sound fade naturally into silence. The lobby was completely, utterly quiet. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. It was as if time had stopped, as if everyone needed a moment to return from wherever the music had taken them. Then someone started clapping. Just one person at first, the teenage girl who'd been crying. Then her mother joined. Then another person. And another. Within seconds, the lobby erupted in applause that seemed to shake the crystal chandeliers. People weren't just clapping. They were cheering, some wiping their eyes, others shaking their heads in disbelief. But Darius wasn't looking at them. He had turned on the piano bench and was looking at Pemberton. The manager stood frozen, his face a canvas of emotions: shock, disbelief, shame, and something that might have been awe. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. The smirk was gone, replaced by an expression that made him look lost, like everything he thought he knew had just been proven wrong. The applause gradually died down as people realized what was supposed to happen next. All eyes turned to Pemberton. Someone in the crowd said, not unkindly but firmly, "You made a promise. Pemberton's assistant touched his arm gently. "Mr. Pemberton," she said quietly, but in the silence, everyone heard her. He played the full ballade, the unedited version. It was... She paused, searching for words. It was perfect. Pemberton looked at Darius, then at Mrs. Robinson, who stood with quiet dignity, her tears dry now but their tracks still visible on her cheeks. He looked at the crowd, at the phones that had captured everything, at the faces that were waiting to see if he was a man of his word. His knees began to bend. Slowly, as if every inch downward was pulling him through years of prejudice and assumptions, Richard Pemberton knelt on the marble floor of his own concert hall. His expensive suit pants touched the cold stone. His hands hung at his sides. His head bowed, not just in defeat, but in something deeper, recognition of how wrong he had been. The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't the tense quiet of anticipation or the awed hush after beautiful music. This was the silence of witnessing something profound, a moment when the world shifted just a little, when someone's entire worldview crumbled and had to be rebuilt. Darius stood up from the piano bench and walked over to where Pemberton knelt. He stopped a few feet away, and for a moment, the boy who had just conquered Chopin looked like what he was, a 14-year-old kid who just wanted to play piano. "Mister," Darius said, his voice quiet but clear. "You can get up now." Pemberton looked up from where he knelt, his eyes meeting Darius's for the first time without judgment, without dismissal, without that superior smirk. What Darius saw instead was something raw and human, a man realizing he had been terribly, shamefully wrong. "No," Pemberton said, his voice hoarse. "Not yet." He shifted on his knees, turning to face Mrs. Robinson. The marble floor had to be hard on his knees, cold through his expensive suit, but he didn't seem to care. The crowd watched in complete silence as this man who had stood so tall and proud just minutes ago humbled himself completely. "Ma'am," he began, and his voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Mrs. Robinson, I owe you an apology. Not just for today, but for every time I've looked at someone and decided they didn't belong before giving them a chance to prove me wrong. I've been in this position for 15 years and He paused, struggling with the words. "I've turned away how many young musicians because they didn't fit my idea of what a classical pianist should look like." Mrs. Robinson stepped forward, her church shoes clicking softly on the marble. She looked down at Pemberton with an expression that wasn't angry or triumphant, just tired. The kind of tired that comes from a lifetime of facing men like him. "Mr. Pemberton," she said quietly, "you can apologize to me if it makes you feel better, but the person you really wronged is my grandson. He's worked harder than you can imagine to get here. 3 years of practicing in the cold, in rooms with barely any heat, on pianos held together with tape and prayers. He's earned his place here through talent and determination, not through money or connections." She paused, then added, "But what breaks my heart is thinking about all the other children you've turned away. How many Dariuses never got their chance because they met someone like you at the door?" Those words hit Pemberton like physical blows. He flinched, and when he spoke again, tears were visible in his eyes. "You're right," he said. "God help me, you're absolutely right." He turned back to Darius. "Young man, I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm asking for it anyway. What you just played, it wasn't just technically perfect. It was alive. It had soul. The kind of playing that reminds us why this music has survived for centuries. You didn't learn that from YouTube videos or even from the best teachers. That came from somewhere deeper." Darius didn't know what to say. He'd imagined this moment, showing up the people who doubted him, but it didn't feel like he thought it would. Instead of triumph, he felt something softer, sadder. He thought about all the kids in his neighborhood who had talents nobody would ever discover, dreams nobody would ever nurture. "I had help," Darius said finally. "Mr. Chen, my art teacher, he opened that first door. Mrs. Fitzgerald, she taught me for free every Saturday. My grandmother, she never stopped believing. Without them, I'm just another kid who never gets a chance." Pemberton finally rose to his feet, his knees cracking audibly. He brushed off his pants absently, but his focus stayed on Darius. "Will you still compete?" he asked. "After what I've put you through, I'd understand if you wanted to leave." "He'll compete," Mrs. Robinson said firmly. "We didn't come all this way to turn back now." What happened next would be talked about in the classical music world for years. Pemberton not only personally registered Darius for the competition, but insisted on introducing him to every judge, making sure they knew about the preliminary scores. He arranged for Darius to have a practice room, one of the good ones, with a properly tuned piano. He even found them a quiet place to rest and prepare, away from the chaos of the main lobby. The video of Darius's impromptu performance went viral before the competition even began. "Kid makes arrogant manager kneel with piano performance," spread across social media like wildfire. By the time Darius walked onto the actual competition stage that evening, the auditorium was packed. People who had never watched a youth piano competition in their lives had driven hours to be there. But Darius didn't know about any of that. When he sat down at the competition piano, he wasn't thinking about viral videos or proving points. He was thinking about his mother, about Mrs. Fitzgerald's patient corrections, about Mr. Chen's smile that first day. He was thinking about every cold afternoon in that band room, every blister on his fingers, every moment he'd wanted to quit but didn't. He played 3 pieces that night: Bach's Invention No. 13, Debussy's Clair de Lune, and, finally, Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor. Each piece showed a different side of his abilities: the mathematical precision of Bach, the dreamy impressionism of Debussy, the raw power of Rachmaninoff. The judges would later say they'd never seen such range in someone so young. When the results were announced, nobody was surprised that Darius won first place. What surprised them was what Pemberton did next. He had spent the hours during the competition making phone calls, pulling in favors, using connections he'd built over 15 years. When Darius stood on that stage holding his trophy, Pemberton walked up with an envelope. "This is from the Steinberg Foundation," he announced to the audience. "A full scholarship to study at Juilliard's pre-college program, including transportation, housing, and a living stipend for your family. They've also arranged for you to have access to a piano for practice, a Steinway like the one you played today." The audience erupted. Mrs. Robinson had to sit down, overwhelmed. Darius stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. Juilliard? The school he'd only read about online, watched in documentaries he'd borrowed from the library. But Pemberton wasn't done. "I've also spoken with the board here at Steinberg Hall. We're starting a new program, the Open Doors Initiative. We'll be partnering with public schools and underserved communities to identify and nurture young musical talent. No fees, no barriers, just opportunity. And we'd like you, Darius, to be our first ambassador, to show other kids that classical music belongs to everyone." 2 years passed in a blur of practice, performance, and growth. Darius thrived at Juilliard, though he never forgot where he came from. He went back to Jefferson Middle once a month to teach kids in that same band room where he'd learned to play. Mr. Chen had gotten funding to fix it up: new heating, better lighting, and 3 pianos donated by families who'd been moved by Darius's story. Mrs. Fitzgerald lived to see him perform at Carnegie Hall. She sat in the front row, in a seat Pemberton had personally arranged and paid for, tears streaming down her face as her student played Chopin's Ballade No. 1 for an audience of 2,000. The boy who'd learned from YouTube videos was now being recorded for Deutsche Grammophon. Pemberton was there too, in the same row as Mrs. Robinson. He'd become an unlikely mentor to Darius, using his knowledge and connections to open doors while making sure Darius walked through them on his own merit. He'd also kept his promise about the Open Doors Initiative. In 2 years, they'd identified and supported 43 young musicians who might never have had a chance otherwise. After the Carnegie Hall performance, at the reception, a reporter asked Darius what advice he'd give to other kids from backgrounds like his who dreamed of playing classical music. Darius thought for a moment, then said, "Find your piano. It doesn't matter if it's out of tune or in a forgotten room. It doesn't matter if people say you don't belong. The music doesn't care where you come from or what you look like. It only cares if you're willing to work, to feel, to pour yourself into every note. And when someone tells you that you can't do it, that you don't belong, he smiled, thinking of that day in the marble lobby. Play anyway. Play like your life depends on it. Because maybe it does. The reporter wrote it all down, but what she couldn't capture was the look that passed between Darius and Pemberton at that moment. The understanding between someone who'd almost been kept out and someone who'd almost done the keeping. Both of them knew how close they'd come to missing this moment, this music, this proof that talent can bloom anywhere if you just give it a chance. As Darius would tell students years later, when he became a teacher himself, the piano had taught him the most important lesson of all, that the most beautiful music often comes from the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is simply the chance to be heard.